My name is Luna. I'm 40 years old, and I used to think I understood the shape of my life. I had a sister named Dara who I loved so completely that I once told my therapist, years later, when I finally had one, that losing her felt like losing a limb I hadn't known was holding me upright. I had a fiancé named Marcus who made me feel, for 7 years, that I was exactly who I was supposed to be. I had a wedding dress hanging in a garment bag in my closet, custom-made, ivory silk with hand-stitched lace at the hem, and I'd cried the first time I put it on because it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever worn and because I was 38 years old, and it felt like proof that good things were still possible. That dress ended up on my sister's body, at a wedding I was not invited to, in photographs I only saw because a cousin texted them to me without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I remember exactly where I was when those photos arrived. I was at my kitchen table drinking cold coffee and reviewing lesson plans. I teach middle school English, and my phone buzzed and I looked down and there was Dara in my dress, Marcus beside her, both of them grinning in the golden afternoon light outside a vineyard I didn't recognize, and everything that had felt like grief for the past 4 months upgraded itself immediately into something I had no word for. Not fury, not shock, something quieter and more total than both of those things. There is a specific kind of devastation that comes not from losing something, but from watching someone take it from you while looking you in the eye and smiling. I had been living inside that devastation since June, but seeing the photographs, seeing her in that dress, that particular shade of ivory against her tanned skin, the lace hem pooling exactly the way it had pooled around my ankles when I'd first tried it on, made something in me go very still. My cousin Priya had texted beneath the photos, "I'm so sorry, I thought you should know before you heard it from someone else. Are you okay?" I sat there for a long time. I thought about typing *no. I thought about typing a lot of things. Eventually I typed, "I'm okay. Thank you for telling me." Then I closed my phone and finished my cold coffee and graded 6 papers on symbolism in the Giver and cried once briefly into my kitchen sink before I washed my face and went to bed. That's who I am. That's the kind of woman I became, somewhere along the way without meaning to. The one who absorbs the unsurvivable things and then makes herself dinner and grades her papers and doesn't call anyone until she's certain she can speak without her voice breaking. I don't know if that's strength or damage, probably both. But I want to tell you the whole story, from the beginning, because the thing about betrayal is that it almost never arrives looking like betrayal. It arrives looking like ordinary life, and you don't understand what happened to you until you trace it backward and find all the moments where the shape of things was already changing, while you stood there believing everything was fine. Dara is 2 years younger than me. She was always the prettier one, or at least that's what we were told, consistently and casually, in the way that families casually destroy their children's self-concepts without meaning to. My mother used to say things like, "Dara has your father's cheekbones," and "Dara just photographs so well," and "Dara could wear a garbage bag and make it look like a runway." These were meant to be compliments to Dara, not criticisms of me. I understood that intellectually, even when I was 12, and those comments sat in my chest like small stones. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was simply a woman who had 2 daughters, and one of them was conventionally beautiful in a way that made strangers comment on it, and she was proud of that, the way people are proud of things they didn't actually create. I was not ugly. I want to be clear about that because I spent too many years believing I was. I have good bones and dark eyes and the kind of face that becomes more interesting as it ages. But I was never the one people noticed first, and Dara had been first since before she could walk, and we both understood this about our family without anyone having to say it directly. What I had was steadiness, reliability, a 4 GPA that my parents celebrated briefly before pivoting to ask if I'd seen how many followers Dara had gotten on Instagram, a career I'd built carefully, a life I'd constructed with intention. I had always been the responsible one, the one who called to check in, who showed up early and stayed late and never made anyone worry. And Dara had always been the one everyone worried about anyway, with a kind of affectionate worry that was, in its own way, another form of attention she got and I didn't. I loved her anyway. I want that to be clear too. I am not rewriting the history of our relationship to make the betrayal more comprehensible. I genuinely loved my sister. We'd shared a bedroom until she was 15, and we'd stayed up late whispering about things we'd never said out loud to anyone else. And when our dad had his first heart attack when I was 26, Dara had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night to be at the hospital. and we'd sat in those plastic chairs together holding hands, and I had felt completely that she was the person who understood me most in the world. That's the thing about loving someone who eventually destroys you. The love is still real, the history is still real, none of it stops being real just because it ends terribly. I met Marcus at a dinner party when I was 31. He was a financial advisor, tall, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from having been told your whole life that you're charming and capable, and I found him attractive in a way that surprised me. I'd been single for 2 years after a long relationship that had ended quietly and without drama, and I genuinely started to believe I was one of those people who is simply better suited to solitude than partnership. Marcus changed that belief. He was attentive in a way I hadn't expected. He remembered small details. He asked follow-up questions. On our third date, he brought up something I'd mentioned in passing on our first date, something about a student I'd been worried about, and asked how it had turned out, and I remember thinking that I had never dated someone who actually listened. We moved slowly. I was careful the way I was careful about everything, and Marcus seemed to appreciate that rather than be frustrated by it. By the time we'd been together 2 years, I had met his family, he had met mine. We had developed the comfortable rhythms of a life shared. Sunday mornings, grocery shopping together, the specific shorthand of 2 people who have witnessed each other in every condition and decided to stay. He met Dara early. She came to a birthday dinner I'd organized about 6 months in, and I remember watching them interact with a kind of quiet happiness. They got along well. Marcus laughed at her jokes. Dara charmed him the way she charmed everyone. I thought, good, this matters to me that the people I love like each other. I thought that for 7 years. I bought a house at 34 and Marcus moved in with me. We talked about marriage for years before we formally got engaged, which happened on a Tuesday evening at home. Not dramatically, not with a ring hidden in a restaurant dessert, but with Marcus sitting across from me at our kitchen table saying, I want to do this properly. I want to marry you. And me saying yes quietly, and meaning it completely. The ring was simple. I'd told him I didn't want anything ostentatious and he'd listened. A thin gold band with a small round diamond. I wore it every day for 2 years. We set a date for the following June. We began planning the wedding with the measured, deliberate energy of 2 people who had waited a long time and wanted to do it right. Not extravagant, small, meaningful. Dara was going to be my maid of honor. Of course she was. The dress took 8 months. I found the designer through a friend of a friend, a woman named Celeste who worked out of a studio in Portland and had a 3-year waiting list but happened to have an opening. I drove 4 hours for the first fitting. I sat with Celeste for 2 hours describing what I wanted: ivory not white, silk not tulle, understated but not plain, and the lace at the hem. She showed me samples and I pointed to one immediately, this delicate, slightly vintage pattern, and said that one. Celeste was the kind of artist who listened to what you said, and then listened to what you meant underneath what you said, and what resulted from those 8 months of fittings was a dress that felt, in an almost uncanny way, like it had been made specifically for my body and my sensibility. It was the most expensive thing I'd ever purchased. It was worth every penny. I brought Dara to the 3rd fitting. She drove up from San Francisco, where she'd been living for 2 years, working in marketing at a tech startup. She sat in Celeste's studio in a vintage chair and watched me step out in the dress, and her expression was, I thought, pure delight. She said, Luna, oh my God, you look extraordinary. I turned in front of the mirror and felt something I can only describe as being entirely oneself, like the dress was just the physical manifestation of something true. Dara took photos on her phone. I asked her not to post them anywhere. I wanted Marcus to see the dress first, wanted that moment to belong to us, and she said, of course, obviously I would never. She seemed to mean it. I believed her completely. I brought that dress home and hung it in its garment bag in my closet, and every time I walked past it something in my chest opened quietly. For 8 months I walked past it every day. It was in that garment bag when I came home to an empty house in June. The warning signs. I know I need to talk about them, and I've spent a long time asking myself why I didn't see them more clearly, and the answer is the same answer everyone who has lived through betrayal eventually arrives at, because you're not looking for it, because you trust the people you love, because the human brain is extraordinarily good at reinterpreting ambiguous information through the lens of what it already believes to be true. I believed Marcus was faithful. I believed Dara loved me. Every piece of evidence I encountered got filtered through those beliefs, reshaped into something that fit. The first thing that happened, the first thing I noticed, though I didn't assign it significance at the time, was in January, 5 months before the wedding. Dara had come to visit for a long weekend. She was between relationships, as she often was. Dara's romantic history was a series of intense but ultimately combustible connections, men who were attracted to her incandescence and then overwhelmed by it, and she seemed, that weekend, lighter than she had in months. Happy in a way that had an almost feverish quality. We went to brunch on Saturday, the three of us. At some point, Marcus and Dara got into a long conversation about a podcast they'd both apparently been listening to, some finance podcast, I think, or maybe something about behavioral economics, and I sat there half listening, eating my eggs, and thought nothing of it except, oh, they've found something in common, that's nice. Afterward, when Dara and I were alone washing dishes, Marcus had gone to run an errand, she said. He's really good for you, Luna. He's different from anyone you've dated before. And I said I know, that's why I'm marrying him. And she smiled at the window in a way I filed away and forgot. The text started, or at least the texts I became aware of started, in February. I didn't go through Marcus's phone. I want to be precise about that. I didn't snoop, didn't suspect enough to search. What happened was that one evening I was using Marcus's phone to look up a restaurant. Mine was charging in the other room. And a text came in from Dara that said hahaha okay, but I'm still right about the third act, and I stared at it for a moment, because it was clearly the continuation of a conversation, and then I put the phone down and felt something flicker at the edge of my consciousness. I asked Marcus about it casually that evening. You and Dara have been texting. He didn't hesitate, didn't shift, he's good, he's always been good, and said yeah, she texted me a few weeks ago about a movie recommendation. We've been going back and forth about films. He smiled. She has strong opinions. I said that's sweet, I meant it, I went to bed. But the flicker was there, small, I kept not looking at it directly. In March, there was a Sunday afternoon when Marcus was supposed to meet me at my school. I was setting up my classroom for a unit I'd been working on, and we'd planned to grab dinner after, and he showed up 45 minutes late and seemed distracted, and when I asked if everything was okay, he said he'd gotten stuck on a call. A work call, he said, on a Sunday. I noted it and set it down somewhere in the back of my mind where I put things I didn't want to examine. Also in March, Dara made a comment at a family dinner, my parents' house, my aunt and uncle visiting, that made me feel, briefly and strangely, as though I'd stepped sideways out of a familiar room into one I didn't recognize. We were talking about the wedding, about the venue, a small vineyard in Sonoma we'd booked, and Dara said about Marcus, he's the kind of man who actually wants to be married. You can tell, not all men are like that. My aunt said how would you know, Dara, have you finally found someone? And everyone laughed and Dara deflected with her characteristic grace and the conversation moved on, and I sat there turning the comment over in my mind. The kind of man who actually wants to be married. How would she know what Marcus wanted? Why had she said it like that, with that specific warmth, that intimate certainty? I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was what wedding planning stress did to your brain, made you see danger everywhere, made you suspect the people you loved. I was right that I was interpreting things. I was wrong that I was interpreting them incorrectly. April is when I knew, though I didn't let myself know that I knew. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in your body before it lives in your mind. A tightening, a wrongness that you can't locate in any single fact. I started waking up at 3 in the morning for no reason I could identify, lying in the dark beside Marcus and listening to him breathe, and feeling the hairs on my arms raised without understanding why. I became quieter, more watchful. I stopped mentioning Dara's name in conversation as often because I'd noticed, could not help but notice, that Marcus brightened almost imperceptibly when her name came up. A fractional thing, the kind of shift you'd only notice if you'd spent 7 years studying someone's face. The week before Easter, Marcus said he'd run into Dara while she was in town for a work thing. She says hi, he told me over dinner. We grabbed coffee, and I said very carefully, oh, she didn't tell me she was in town, and Marcus said it was last minute, I think, a quick trip. I texted Dara that night. Hey, Marcus said you were in town last week. She texted back 40 minutes later. Yeah, sorry, it was such a whirlwind I barely had time to breathe. I'm sorry I didn't reach out, next time for sure, with a heart emoji. I stared at that text for a long time. We had never, in our entire adult lives, been in the same city without seeing each other if there was any possibility of making it work. Dara had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night to be with me at the hospital, and now she'd been in my city where I lived, where she'd grown up and hadn't called. I put my phone down. I went to watch television with Marcus. We sat on the couch the way we always sat on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, and I watched whatever was on and felt the knowledge that I was not allowing myself to have humming underneath everything like a frequency I was refusing to tune to. That Easter my mother told me Dara seemed different lately. Happier, she said with a kind of careful emphasis that made me think she was watching my face as she said it. I asked what she meant. My mother said you know how she gets when she's interested in someone. She has that energy. And then she changed the subject. I should have asked more questions. I should have had the conversation I was terrified to have. Instead, I helped my mother set the table and let the moment pass, because I had perfected the art of letting dangerous moments pass, and because some part of me had already started to understand that the thing I was afraid of was true, and that knowing it for certain would destroy my life, and I was not ready for that yet. I found out on a Saturday morning in late May, 18 days before the wedding. I found out because I looked. I finally allowed myself to look. Marcus had left his email open on the shared laptop. I don't know what I was looking for, some confirmation, some detail that would either alarm me or reassure me. I sat down to look up something for school and there was his inbox, right there, and at the top was a thread with a subject line that was just her name. Dareth. The thread had 37 emails. The most recent one was from the night before. I read it. I won't reproduce all of it here because I've spent 2 years trying to scrub the exact phrasing of certain sentences from my memory, but what I need to tell you is this. They had been in love, or in whatever they were calling love, for at least 4 months, possibly longer. The emails were specific and intimate, and full of the particular vocabulary of people who have developed a shared emotional world. Inside references, callbacks to conversations, a tenderness that I recognized because it was the same tenderness Marcus had once trained on me, and I had believed was mine specifically. One email from early April, Marcus had written, "I know this is wrong and I know I need to figure out what I'm doing, but I don't know how to stop." And Dara had written back, "I don't want you to stop." I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen for 25 minutes without moving. Then I heard Marcus come down the stairs and I thought with extraordinary clarity, I am not going to fall apart in front of him. Not yet. He came into the kitchen. He said *morning and moved to start the coffee, and I watched his back and thought about 18 days. 18 days until what was supposed to be my wedding. I said very quietly, "How long?" He turned around. He knew immediately what I meant. I saw it in his face, the way the blood left it. He didn't try to pretend. Give him that much at least. He said Luna. I said *how long again, same quiet voice, not angry, not screaming, just needing the factual information. He told me, 4 months, maybe slightly longer. He wasn't sure exactly when it had started. They hadn't, he hesitated, and I told him I didn't want the details of what they had or hadn't done. I wanted to know when, and I wanted to know if he was still planning to marry me. The silence that followed that question lasted long enough that I had my answer before he spoke. He said, "I think I need some time to figure out." I said no, just that. No. Then I stood up and walked to our bedroom and I started making calls. I called the venue first, I called the caterer, I called the florist. I made every call I needed to make, one after another, in a row, sitting on the edge of our bed, the bed we'd shared for 6 years, while Marcus stood in the doorway saying my name periodically, and I ignored him until I'd finished all the calls, and then I looked at him and said, with the steadiness that I had apparently been cultivating my entire life for exactly this moment, "You should probably call Dara and tell her I know." Then I called my best friend Keisha. She drove over in 40 minutes. She walked in the door and took one look at my face and didn't say anything, just held me, and I finally fell apart. Keisha has been my best friend since college. She is a pediatric nurse, which means she has spent 15 years maintaining competence and compassion in situations that would break most people, and she brought both of those things to my kitchen table that Saturday and didn't leave until I had eaten something and stopped shaking. "Tell me everything, she said. I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you surprised?" Not unkindly, just genuinely asking. I thought about it. I said, "I don't know." She said, "Because I want to be honest with you. I saw them together at your birthday in February and I had a thought, and I should have told you, and I'm sorry I didn't. She looked miserable. I talked myself out of it. I thought I was projecting. What kind of thought? The way he looked at her, Keisha said carefully. It was just for a second he looked at her like he'd forgotten where he was. She put her hand over mine. I'm so sorry, Luna. I sat with that. My birthday in February, 2 months after what Marcus claimed was the beginning, which meant that on my birthday at the party Keisha had helped me plan, Marcus had already been wherever he was with my sister. I asked Keisha to help me figure out where to start. She pulled out a notepad. She's a notepad person, lists and logistics, which is one of the reasons I love her, and we wrote down everything I needed to do. The wedding cancellations, calling family, figuring out the house which was in my name, figuring out my own survival. We did not at that point know about the dress. The family calls were the worst part of the first week. My parents already knew. Not the full extent, I don't think they knew the precise timeline, but they knew that Dara and Marcus had developed feelings, because Dara had called our mother the week before and apparently described the situation as *complicated and *unplanned, and no one meant for this to happen. My mother, in her characteristic way, had chosen to wait and see rather than warn me. When I called her, she answered on the first ring. I said, "Mom." She said, "Oh, Luna," in a voice that confirmed everything. The conversation that followed was one of the most disorienting of my life. My mother was sorry. My mother was also, within the same breath, explaining that Dara hadn't meant to hurt me, that these things were complicated, that love was unpredictable. I sat there listening to my mother defend my sister's choices to me while I was sitting in the house I owned, having just cancelled my wedding, and felt something go flat inside me. Not anger, I didn't have anger yet, that would come later. Just a flatness. A recognition. My father took the phone next. He said, "This is terrible, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. Full stop, no explanations, no both sidesing. Just terrible, I'm sorry." I almost cried. I said thank you, Dad, and meant it with everything I had. My mother took the phone back. She said, "I think we all just need to let things settle a bit before we make any decisions." I said, "What decisions?" She said, "Well, your relationship with Dara, your sisters, this doesn't have to." I said, "Mom, just that." She stopped. I said, "I will call you in a few days," and I hung up. I called my Aunt Patricia next. Aunt Patricia is my mother's sister, a retired school teacher who has always been the family member who tells the truth at whatever cost. She said, "I heard. I'm furious on your behalf. What do you need?" I loved her so much in that moment I couldn't speak for a few seconds. What I needed, I told her eventually, was for someone to tell my extended family so I didn't have to make 40 phone calls. Patricia said she'd handle it. She made it sound exactly as straightforward as that. Dara called me on Sunday. I let it go to voicemail. I let the next call go to voicemail too. On the third call, I picked up and said, "I'm not ready to talk to you yet," and hung up before she could respond. She texted, "I know you're hurting. I want you to know that I love you and I never meant." I turned off my phone. Marcus left the house within the week. He had family in Sacramento and he drove there, taking what was his and leaving the rest, and I stood in the bedroom afterward looking at the empty space on his side of the closet and felt nothing, which was either shock or the beginning of something more durable. The house was mine. We'd bought it together in the sense that we'd both lived in it and contributed to the life within it, but the title was in my name. I'd had better credit, I'd been more financially established, and Marcus had never pushed to have his name added because we'd always assumed we would marry and it would become a shared asset anyway. That assumption, it turned out, worked in my favor. I asked a lawyer friend to check whether there were any complications. There weren't. The house was mine. I spent the week after Marcus left in a state that I can only describe as highly functional devastation. I went to work. I taught my classes. I graded papers. I ate regular meals because Keisha kept bringing food and sitting with me while I ate it and looking at me with the specific vigilance of someone monitoring a patient. I slept badly, but I slept. I did not post anything on social media. I did not call Marcus. I did not respond to Dara's increasingly long text messages, which I read once and then put away. One of Dara's texts said, "I know you don't understand right now, but what Marcus and I have is real. I didn't plan this. Neither did he. I hope someday you can see that." I stared at that text for a long time. I hope someday you can see that. The framing of it, the patient condescension in it, the way it positioned my devastation as a failure of understanding rather than a reasonable response to betrayal, told me more than anything else she could have said about where Dara's head was. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was waiting for me to catch up to her narrative. I filed that understanding away. The dress. I need to tell you about the dress. I had, in the immediate chaos of the wedding cancellation, completely forgotten about it. Or not forgotten, I knew it was there in its garment bag in my closet, but I had so many other things to manage that the dress existed in my mind as a future problem, something I'd deal with once the immediate crisis had stabilized. I'd thought vaguely that I would see if Celeste would buy it back, or find a consignment shop, or donate it to an organization that provides wedding dresses to people who can't afford them. I'd thought this without much feeling, because my capacity for feeling was occupied elsewhere. 6 weeks after the breakup, when some of the numbness had started to lift, and I was beginning to move through the world with something approaching normalcy, I went to my closet to look at the dress. I'd been thinking about calling Celeste. The garment bag was gone. I stood in front of the empty space in my closet for a long moment, not understanding, and then I began going through the sequence of events, and realized the only time anyone had been alone in my house, near that closet, was 3 weeks earlier when Dara had come to collect some things she'd stored in my spare room, some boxes that had been there since she'd moved to San Francisco. I had been in the kitchen when she arrived. I had let her in and then gone back to the kitchen. I hadn't wanted to watch her gather her things, hadn't trusted my own reaction to seeing her, and she'd been in the house for maybe 25 minutes before she said goodbye and left. I'd heard her on the stairs. The spare room was upstairs, and the bedroom, my bedroom, was also upstairs. I sat down on the floor of my closet. I thought she took my dress. I called Keisha. Keisha said after a long silence, "I'm coming over." She came over. She stood in my closet doorway and looked at the empty space and said, "Luna." Just that word in a voice I'd never heard from her before, something between fury and grief. I said she took it, still sitting on the floor. Keisha said, "I know." I said, "I need you to tell me what to do because I don't have any idea what to do." Keisha sat down on the floor next to me. We sat there together for a while, then she said you could report it stolen. I thought about that. I thought about calling the police on my sister, about what that would mean, what it would set in motion, what it would become in the family mythology. Then I thought about the dress, about Celeste's hours, about the 8 months of fittings. I called Dara. She answered. I said very quietly, "You took the dress." There was a pause, then Dara said, "Luna." I said, "You took my dress." She said, "I was going to tell you. I wanted to ask you first, but I wasn't sure how to." I said, "So you just took it." Another pause, then in a voice that contained something I would have called guilt if I hadn't been paying attention, she said, "It fits me. It fits me perfectly, Luna. It's like it was made for us to be the same size." I thought, I know it's a lot to ask, I know it's complicated, but it's such a beautiful dress and I didn't want it to just sit somewhere. I said it was made for me, Dara, by a person I hired who spent 8 months on it, who built it for my body and my wedding. She said, "I know." I said, "Give it back." Long silence. Then, "We're getting married, Luna. Marcus and I are getting married." And I thought, I know this sounds terrible, but I thought that the dress could, I don't know, be something that connected all of it somehow. I said, "Are you insane?" First time my voice had gone up, first crack in the quiet. Dara said with sudden firmness, "I'll pay you for it. Whatever you paid Celeste, I'll pay you." As if that were the point. As if the dress were just property, just a transaction. I hung up. I spoke to a lawyer about the dress, the same friend I'd consulted about the house. He told me it was theft, technically, and I could pursue it, but that the process would be time-consuming and expensive, and ultimately likely to result in either a financial settlement or nothing at all, since Dara had clearly taken it with the intent to keep it. He said the decision was mine. I thought about it for a week. Then I decided, and I want to explain my reasoning because people have asked about it, and I think the reasoning matters. I didn't pursue legal action because I decided that my energy was worth more than the fight. Not because I wasn't angry, I was enraged, in the specific cold way that is more dangerous than the hot kind, but because I understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that if I spent the next months in a legal battle with my sister over a dress, I would be in a legal battle with my sister over a dress, while Dara and Marcus planned their wedding and lived their lives. The battle would consume me. It would keep me attached to them in the worst possible way. It would be the opposite of free. I had paid a great deal of money for that dress. I chose to release it, not as a gift to Dara, not as forgiveness, as a decision about what I was going to spend my life on. I told Keisha. She said, "I support you." Then she said, "I want to be clear that I think what she did is the most unconscionable thing I've ever heard, and I'd like 5 minutes alone with her." I said, "I know. Keisha has always been very good at holding both things at once." I sent Dara a single text, "Keep the dress. I won't be contacting you again for the foreseeable future. Don't contact me." She wrote back, "Luna, I love you. I hope you know that." And then after a pause, "Thank you." I put my phone face down on the table. I made dinner. I graded papers. I went to sleep. October. The photos arrived in October, as I told you. My cousin Priya's text with the vineyard photos, Dara in ivory silk, Marcus beside her, everyone squinting into the golden afternoon. They'd moved fast, 4 months from the breakup to married. I sat with that timeline and turned it over. In some ways it wasn't surprising, the intensity of new love, the particular mania of people who have done something they know is indefensible and need the structure of commitment to justify it to themselves. In some ways it felt like a statement. Look how quickly we could do what took you years to plan. I found, looking at those photos, that I felt very little for Marcus. I examined my feelings carefully, the way you check a wound, and what I found was not love, not longing, not even much anger. Mostly a kind of sad familiarity, like seeing someone who used to mean everything to you and realizing they had become, somehow, a stranger while you weren't watching. What I felt for Dara was more complicated, layered in a way that I couldn't fully parse. Grief for who I'd thought she was, a terrible recognition, she's wearing the dress, she's at the vineyard, she's taken the whole architecture of the life I'd imagined and she's standing inside it looking out. And beneath the grief, something that was not quite satisfaction, not yet, but its precursor, the quiet knowledge that this was not going to end the way she thought it was going to end. I did not know yet exactly what I meant by that. I would learn over the next several months, as the shape of Marcus's secrets began to emerge. I started therapy in October, the same week I saw the photos. I want to talk about this because I think it mattered more than almost anything else in this story, and I want to resist the temptation to treat it as a footnote. My therapist's name is Dr. Chen. She is a small, precise woman in her late 50s who has a stillness about her that I found reassuring in the same way I find certain landscapes reassuring, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just solid and real. She had a practice near my school, which is how I found her, and I sat across from her for the first time in early October and said I need help figuring out what happened to me without losing my mind in the process. She said that's a good framing, and we started. What emerged over the following months was not, as I'd feared, a verdict on my obliviousness, a detailed accounting of all the signs I'd missed, all the moments where I'd been willfully blind. What emerged was something more useful, a slowly developing understanding of how I had learned, growing up, to absorb harm in silence, to minimize my own distress, to make myself small around the people I loved because smallness felt like safety. I had done this with Marcus. I had done it with Dara. I had done it so thoroughly and for so long that I hadn't even known I was doing it. "You have a pattern," Dr. Chen said in one of our early sessions, not unkindly, of interpreting your own perceptions as problems to be managed rather than information to act on. I thought about that for a long time. Then I said I think my family taught me that my perceptions were often wrong. She said, "Yes, tell me about that." And we were off. November. Keisha called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice careful in the way it got when she had something to tell me that she wasn't sure how to tell me. "I ran into Claire today," she said. Claire was the wife of one of Marcus's co-workers, someone Keisha and I both knew tangentially, through overlapping social circles. "Okay, I said. "We got to talking, Keisha said. She mentioned Marcus." I waited. "She mentioned that some things have come up at his firm," Keisha said. "Compliance things. She wasn't specific, she said she didn't have details, but she said there's been some kind of investigation and that Marcus is involved." I sat with that. Investigation by whom? She wasn't sure. Internal, she thought, maybe regulatory. Keisha paused. She said she didn't know if it was serious or not. She was being careful. I said okay. Then I said thank you for telling me. After we hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about what Marcus's career had looked like in the last year or so. He was a financial advisor at a mid-sized firm. He'd had what he described as a very good year, performance-wise, though I hadn't scrutinized the details. His finances were his finances, my finances were mine. We'd kept a rough equity in the household expenses, but otherwise operated independently. He talked about bringing in new clients. He talked about a particular account that had done exceptionally well. He'd been, looking back, slightly cagey about the specifics, which I had attributed at the time to financial privacy norms and not to anything else. I thought, what does Dara know about Marcus's work? And then I thought, what does Marcus know about Marcus's work? The shape of Marcus's secrets was this. He had been, for approximately 3 years, operating at the edge of what was legal in ways that were going to become very much his problem. I learned this in pieces over the following several months, through a combination of sources. Keisha's connections, cousin Priya's information network. Priya worked in finance herself and had her own lines of communication, and eventually a piece in a financial news outlet that covered the regulatory action when it became public. Here is the summary. Marcus had been churning client accounts. This means executing unnecessary trades to generate commissions. It is a fraud. It's not the most spectacular kind of fraud. It's not embezzlement. It's not a Ponzi scheme, but it's illegal. It's an abuse of client trust. And when regulators catch it, the consequences are severe. He was also, separate from the churning, suspected of recommending investments in which he had undisclosed personal interests. Again, not the most dramatic crime in the world, but a crime. A sustained, deliberate, calculated crime conducted over years involving numerous clients who had trusted him to act in their interests. The regulatory investigation had begun approximately 8 months before our breakup. This means that Marcus, charming, attentive, emotionally intelligent Marcus, had been conducting an affair with my sister, allowing me to plan a wedding, watching me order flowers and coordinate with caterers and drive to Portland for dress fittings, all while knowing that his professional life was under investigation and might collapse. He had told neither me nor, as far as I could determine, Dara. He had been planning to marry me, or to let me believe he was planning to marry me, while this was happening. And then he had abandoned that plan and married my sister instead, bringing her directly into the arc of a financial catastrophe she had no idea was coming. I thought about whether to tell Dara. I thought about it for a long time. I sat with it in Dr. Chen's office, and I sat with it in my living room, and I talked to Keisha about it, and I thought about it in the shower and on my runs, and in the 10 minutes before I fell asleep at night. The argument for telling her, she was going to find out eventually, and finding out from me early with time to prepare was better than finding out through a news article or a legal notice. She might be able to protect herself financially if she knew in advance. She might be able to leave before things got worse. The argument against, she had not shown me any of the consideration she would have expected from me. She had taken my dress and my fiancé and built a life on the ruins of mine without apology, and now she was living with the consequences of marrying someone she didn't actually know, and those consequences were not my responsibility to prevent. Dr. Chen, to her credit, did not tell me what to do. She asked me what I valued. She asked me who I wanted to be. She asked me if my choice would be the same regardless of whether Dara deserved my help, which is a different question than it sounds like. In the end, I made a decision that surprised me. I will tell you what it was after I explain what happened next. December. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon, with a particular quality of hesitation in her voice that I'd come to associate with conversations she was preparing herself to have. I'd been maintaining a cautious, minimal contact with my parents since everything had imploded. We spoke occasionally. They'd begun the careful project of pretending that 2 coexisting daughters in a state of complete estrangement was simply a phase, a rough patch, something the holiday season might smooth over. I had, for the sake of my own peace, chosen not to directly disabuse them of this notion. My mother said, "How are you doing, sweetheart?" I said okay, teaching is good. She made some small talk, then she said Dara came for Thanksgiving, she and Marcus. I had known this because I'd chosen not to go to Thanksgiving, and I had known they would be there. I said yes, you mentioned. She seems happy, my mother said. Then carefully, though I'm not sure, something seems off somehow. I waited. Marcus was, I don't know, my mother said, distracted, tense about something. Your father said he seemed like he had a lot on his mind. I said *MM. Do you know if anything is going on with him professionally? My mother asked. The question was careful, too careful. I said *, why would I know that? Long pause. I just thought since you were together for so long. We've been broken up for 6 months, Mom. Gently, not cruel, just factual. Right *, she said. Of course, another pause. I just worry about Dara. I sat with that sentence. I could have said many things. I chose to say she's a grown woman. She made her choices. My mother said I know she did. And then in a voice that surprised me, I should have called you sooner after everything happened. I should have said more. I said * yes. She said * I'm sorry, Luna. It was the most direct apology I'd received from her. I believed it was genuine. I also knew it didn't change the architecture of what had happened. The months of equivocating, the both sidesing, the way she'd positioned my devastation as something that needed to be modulated rather than honored. An apology doesn't rebuild the room it arrived too late to prevent from burning down. I said thank you, Mom, and I meant it in the complicated way you can mean something that arrives incomplete. January, the regulatory action became public. A brief notice in a financial industry publication, which Priya forwarded to me with a text that just said it's starting. Marcus's firm had taken a settlement, the firm itself paid a fine, several advisors received sanctions, and the investigation of specific individuals for more serious charges was ongoing. Marcus's name was in the article. Not the headline, not prominently featured, but there, in a paragraph near the bottom, among those whose individual conduct is under continued review. I read that paragraph several times. Then I closed my laptop and went to make tea and stood in my kitchen thinking about what I knew about Dara's financial situation. She had a good salary at the tech company. She had some savings, I knew this roughly. We talked about money in the abstract over the years the way siblings do. What I didn't know was whether she and Marcus had commingled their finances since their marriage, or whether Dara had kept her separate, or what Marcus's actual financial condition looked like beneath the performance of success he'd maintained for years. Because that was the other thing, which I'd known in abstract and was coming to understand more concretely. Marcus's financial success had always looked better than it was. The expensive dinners, the tasteful vacations, the appearance of a man who was genuinely doing well, these had been real things, real expenditures, but funded in ways I hadn't known to question. He made good money. He'd spent more than he'd made. The churning of client accounts was partly, I suspected, about covering the gap. I decided to tell Dara. Not immediately. Not in January when the news broke and it might have looked like gloating, like an * I told you so delivered publicly where everyone could see. I waited. I thought about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it, and whether saying it would feel like the thing I intended it to feel like or whether, in the execution, it would become something else. February, I sent her an email. Not a text. Emails require more deliberateness, more composure, and I wanted to be deliberate. I wrote, Dara *. I'm not writing to rehash what happened between us. I'm writing because I've come across information about Marcus that I think you should have access to, regardless of the state of our relationship. His name appears in a financial regulatory action from last month. The article is publicly available. You may already know about it. If you don't, you should look it up. You should speak to a financial advisor and potentially a lawyer about what it means for your joint finances and your personal assets. You should do this soon. I'm not writing this to cause you pain. I'm writing it because you're my sister, and because I don't want something bad to happen to you that could have been prevented. This is probably the last contact I'll initiate for a while. I hope you'll take care of yourself. Luna. I read it over several times. It was honest. It was factual. It was not cruel, or if it was the unavoidable cruelty of truth delivered in someone's direction. I sent it, and then I closed my laptop and went for a run, and when I came back I did not check for a response for 2 hours. When I did check, there was a response. It was brief. Luna *. I know, he told me some of it a few weeks ago. I don't know the extent. Thank you for telling me anyway. I don't know what's going to happen. I love you, even if I understand if you don't want to hear that. Dara asterisk. I sat with that response for a long time. He told me some of it. How much of it? When? Was she the one who'd finally forced the truth out of him, or had he volunteered it? And what did I don't know what's going to happen mean about the state of their marriage? I did not write back, but something in me settled slightly. Not satisfaction, it wasn't that. More like the release of a pressure I'd been holding, the pressure of knowing something that the people affected by it didn't know. I'd given her the information. What she did with it was her own. Spring arrived the way it always does in Northern California, gradually, then all at once. My garden, which I'd let go somewhat in the devastated second half of the previous year, suddenly needed attention, and I found myself outside in the early mornings pulling weeds and thinking about almost nothing, which was new. I had been for so long a person who could not stop thinking. The quiet was a revelation. I'd changed jobs slightly, not schools, but taken on a department head position that had opened up. More responsibility, more engagement, something to organize my professional energy around. My students were reading Morrison that semester, and the conversations were extraordinary, the kind of classroom discussions that remind you why you chose this work, and I left school every day feeling used in the good sense, exhausted and purposeful. I started running seriously. I'd always been a casual runner, 3 or 4 miles a few times a week, but I found in the fall that long runs were the only thing that quieted the particular noise in my head, and by spring I was training for a half marathon and running 7 or 8 miles most mornings before dawn. There was something about the physical demand of it that I needed, the way it required everything from me and left no room for anything else. I was not dating. People asked, Keisha asked gently, and I said no, not yet, and I meant it. I didn't feel ready for another person's emotional reality. I was still learning to occupy my own. What I was doing mostly was becoming myself, which sounds simple and is actually the most complicated thing I've ever done. The information about Marcus's situation reached my family properly in the spring, the way information tends to eventually reach families, not through any single announcement, but through a gradual accumulation of hints and overheard conversations and things cousins told cousins, until everyone had a rough picture. My father called me in March. He said, I've been hearing things about Marcus. I said asterisk yes. He said asterisk, is it as serious as it sounds? I said I think it might be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said asterisk, how are you feeling about all of this? I said asterisk, honestly, I feel pretty okay. He said yeah. I said I think I would have found out about it eventually if I'd married him, and that would have been worse. He was quiet again. Then he said in the voice he uses when he's working up to something, I want you to know that your mother and we should have handled things differently. Last summer, we should have been clearer about where we stood. I said asterisk yes, not cruel, just true. We were trying to keep the peace, he said, and I think in doing that we made it worse for you. I'm sorry, Luna. I know, I said, I accept that. There was a pause, then he said, you seem different. I asked asterisk, different how? He said steadier, like you've settled into yourself somehow. He paused, you always were the steadier one, I should have told you that more. I had to hold the phone away from my face for a moment. When I trusted my voice, I said thank you, Dad. And we talked for another 20 minutes about my running and his garden and the book he was reading, and it was one of the best conversations I'd had with my father in years. My Aunt Patricia came to visit in April. She drove up from Los Angeles, where she'd retired, ostensibly for a week of catching up, but actually, I think, because she wanted to see for herself that I was okay. She is not a woman who does things obliquely. She arrived with wine and opinions. We sat at my kitchen table that first evening, and she told me, in the frank, detailed way that is her native language, everything she'd observed from the family's periphery over the past several months. Dara and Marcus had been fighting. This was the family consensus, conveyed to my mother and thence to Patricia, conveyed to me with the serial telephone precision of family information chains. The fights were, by all accounts, serious, not the productive disagreements of two people working through challenges together, but the specific, corrosive arguments of a marriage that was discovering it was not what it had appeared to be. She didn't know what she was getting into, Patricia said, not with sympathy for Dara exactly, but with the clarity of someone who has seen this pattern before. She built the whole thing on wanting to win, and now she's living in what she won, and it's not what she thought it was. I said asterisk no. Patricia looked at me carefully. How are you doing with all of it? I said asterisk, I'm doing well. And then because it was Patricia, I mean it, I'm doing genuinely well, better than I've done in years maybe. She studied me. You're not angry anymore. I was angry for a while, I said. I'm mostly not now. I thought about how to explain it. I think I stopped being angry when I understood that this had very little to do with me actually. Dara didn't do what she did because of something I'd done wrong or something that was wrong with me. She did it because of who she is, and Marcus let her because of who he is. And those things were always true. I just didn't know yet. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother worries you'll never forgive Dara." I said I might not, and that's okay. Is it? Forgiveness isn't mandatory, I said. I'm not carrying anger, but I'm also not obligated to pretend nothing happened. Those aren't the only two options. Patricia nodded slowly. She poured more wine. She said, "I think you're wiser than all of us." I said, "I think I just had more time to think." May, 1 year after the collapse. I ran my half marathon on a cool Saturday morning in May and finished in 2 hours and 4 minutes, which was better than I'd expected. And Keisha met me at the finish line with a sign she'd made that said, "You survived worse than this hill" in large letters, which made me laugh until I cried. And we went for breakfast afterward at the place we'd been going to since college and sat for 3 hours eating and talking, and I felt, sitting there, something I had not felt in a long time. Entirely okay. Not okay enough, not okay considering, just okay, present and fed and cared for and in possession of a life that was mine. June, the 2nd June. I want to tell you about what happened at the end of June, because I think it's important. Dara called me, not a text, she called. I'd had since February's email exchange, a kind of remote but functional minimal contact with her. Occasional texts, mostly information-based, no real conversations. She had stopped trying to have deeper contact, which I'd taken as a sign that she understood on some level that I needed that distance. But she called in late June, and I answered because I was in a place where I could. She sounded tired, a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleep. I recognized it. She said, "I want to talk to you, if you're willing." I said, "Okay." What followed was a long conversation, the longest we'd had since everything had happened. She told me about the marriage, not everything but the shape of things, the fights, the lies she was still finding still. The investigation which had progressed. Marcus had received an individual sanction, a fine, a bar from the industry for 3 years. He was appealing it, but the appeal was unlikely to succeed. His income had dropped significantly. He'd had to take a different kind of work. The financial strain was real. She told me he'd been emotionally distant since the investigation became public, cold in ways she hadn't seen before. She said I thought I knew him, in a voice so genuinely bewildered that I had to hold the phone away from my face for a moment. I said, "I know." She said, "Did you know? Did you know about the work stuff when you were together?" I said, "No, I found out after, in pieces the same way you did." Long silence. She said, "I'm so sorry, Luna." Not for the first time she had said it in texts in the email, but this was different. This was the sound of someone who understood now, specifically what they'd done, in a way that I'm sorry in the abstract can't contain. "I'm so sorry. I did something I can't undo, and I'm living in the consequences of it, and I would give a lot to go back." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it. I said, "No, I don't hate you. I'm not sure I know exactly what I feel about you honestly, but it's not hate." She said, "I love you," in a small, exhausted voice. I said, "I love you too," because I did. Because the love and the harm and the loss and the history were all true simultaneously, and I was not willing to pretend they weren't. But I also said, "I need you to know that love doesn't fix what happened, and I'm not sure what we are to each other now or what we can be. I'm not closing the door, but I can't pretend we're who we used to be." She said, "I know, I understand that." We talked for another hour. Not about Marcus, not about the dress, not about the wedding. About our parents. About the years when we were children and shared a room and stayed up late whispering. About a camping trip we'd taken with our family when I was 12 and Dara was 10, and we'd gotten lost on a trail for 3 hours and held hands because we were scared, and eventually found our way back to the campsite. When we hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time. I need to tell you about the dress one more time, because there's an end to its story. About a month after that conversation with Dara, she texted me, "I need to tell you something about the dress." I waited. Then I've never worn it. After the vineyard photos, I tried it on twice and couldn't bring myself to actually wear it. I kept thinking about Celeste and about how you looked in it. I put it in storage. I read that and sat with it. Then she texted, "I want to give it back to you, if you want it. Or if you'd rather I give it to Celeste or donate it somewhere, I'll do that. It's yours. It was always yours." I thought about this for a few days, then I texted Celeste. Celeste remembered me, of course. We had a long call. I explained the situation in overview, not in detail, and asked what she thought. She said, "If you want it back, I can alter it for you. If you don't want it, I have a buyer who's been asking about it. She's been following my work and specifically asked about ivory silk with that lace pattern." She paused. "It would go to someone who loves it, someone who doesn't know its history." I made a decision. Not the one people expected, probably. I told Celeste to sell it to the other woman. I told Dara to bring it to Celeste's studio, and she did, and Celeste sold it to someone who would wear it at her own wedding to her own person, at a ceremony entirely unrelated to any of us. I got a percentage of the sale price. I donated it to an organization that helps domestic violence survivors start over, which felt, somehow, like the right ending for a story about starting over. July, late summer now, my second summer after. Marcus and Dara's marriage is still technically intact as of this writing. I believe it's only technically. The last information I have is that they're living in a different apartment. They sold the condo they'd bought together, a financial necessity rather than a choice, and that Marcus is working at a firm in a different city in a non-advisory capacity, which is what happens when you've been barred from advising. Dara is still at her tech job. I have no reliable intelligence on whether they're happy or working on it, or simply in the endgame of something that was always going to end. It's not my concern. That's the surprising thing, the thing that continues to surprise me. It is genuinely not my concern. My family has healed in some directions and not others. My mother and I are closer than we were, not in the same way as before. That specific kind of closeness was predicated on me accepting her equivocations, and I no longer do, but in a more honest way. We talk weekly. She sometimes says something that reveals she still doesn't fully understand the depth of what Dara did, and I have learned not to fight those moments, to simply state my perspective and move on. She is trying. She is a woman of her generation, shaped by a belief that family unity trumps individual injury, and she's trying to expand that belief. I appreciate the trying. My father is straightforward. He was wrong and he knows it, and he said so. We talk about books. Aunt Patricia has become a close friend in a way that feels like an upgrade from the previous arrangement. She texts me almost daily. Priya and I have a standing Sunday phone call. There is something I want to say about the revenge, because I know that's part of why people are reading this. I know there's a narrative people want, that I orchestrated the exposure of Marcus's fraud, that I engineered Dara's comeuppance, that I pulled strings from the background in some satisfying and cinematic way. I didn't. I found out about Marcus's situation through normal channels and processed it privately. I sent Dara one email. Everything that happened after that happened because Marcus did things that had consequences, and those consequences arrived on their own schedule without my assistance. The revenge, if you want to call it that, is simply this. I'm here. I'm teaching my students about symbolism in literature and running long distances in the early morning and growing tomatoes in my garden and calling my father on Sundays and going to therapy every other week and building a life that is entirely, specifically mine. The revenge is that I did not become what they seem to expect me to become. Bitter, diminished, defined by the loss. The most satisfying moment, the one I've returned to in my mind during hard days, was not when the regulatory news became public, or when Dara called me exhausted and sorry. It was earlier, simpler. It was running alone at 6 in the morning through a quiet neighborhood, in the dark before sunrise, moving through the world in my own body with my own thoughts, and realizing with the specific clarity that comes from physical effort that I had stopped wanting them back. Not the relationship, not my sister the way she used to be, not the wedding, not even the dress. I had stopped wanting any of it. Not because I had something better to want, but because I had become, somewhere in the past year, someone whose life was entirely oriented toward what was actually in front of her, toward the present, toward the real. That was when I knew I was going to be okay, not okay enough, actually okay. I think about my sister a lot, and what I've arrived at is this. Dara didn't steal my life because she wanted my life. She stole it because she wanted desperately to win. And what she didn't understand, what she couldn't see from inside the narrative she'd built, is that you can't win someone else's life. You can only take possession of the external pieces of it, the dress and the man and the venue and the aesthetic. What you can't take is the interior. What you can't take is who someone actually is. She took my dress. She couldn't take what I'd become while choosing it, fitting it, walking past it in the dark. She took Marcus. She couldn't take what 7 years of loving someone had made of me, the capacity for commitment, the knowledge of my own wants, the ability to finally recognize a lie when it was standing in front of me. She tried to inherit a life. Instead, she inherited a fraud. The saddest part of the whole story, the part that keeps me awake sometimes, not with anger, just with a kind of ache, is not what she did to me. It's what she was willing to trade for it. We were close. We were genuinely close, whatever else was true. She traded something real for something she thought was better, and what she got was the performance of better, not the thing itself. I don't know if she understands that yet. Last week I was walking past a bridal shop near my school. Not looking in, not particularly thinking about weddings. I was on my way back from the coffee place around the corner and my mind was on a lesson plan, and I stopped because the dress in the window caught my eye. Not because it was similar to mine, because it was completely different. Deep midnight blue, utterly untraditional, something I'd never have picked for myself, and it was extraordinary. I stood there looking at it for a moment. I thought, someday maybe, not desperately, not with longing, just as a possibility, a future that was still possible. Then I went back to school and taught my afternoon classes. I have a date next week, first one since everything. A friend introduced us, a man named Daniel who teaches history at a high school across town. We've talked on the phone 3 times and he makes me laugh and asks genuine questions and seems, on all the evidence available, like someone who actually listens. I'm aware this is not a guarantee of anything. I've learned, if nothing else, that people are not always who they appear to be, and that the gap between a person's presentation and their interior can be vast and dark. But I'm going in with my eyes open and my expectations calibrated and some knowledge of what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not. I'm going as myself, not the version of myself that made herself small so that other people felt comfortable, but the full version, the one who has opinions and edges and a gardener's calluses on her hands and 7 years of grief she's metabolized into clarity. He seems nice, we'll see. There's a garment bag in my hallway closet that used to hold my wedding dress. I kept it after the dress left. I'm not sure why, possibly just organizational habit, the way you keep packaging sometimes without meaning to. It hangs there, empty, perfectly white. I pass it every time I go for my morning run. At 5:30 in the morning in the dark, reaching for my jacket, I see the white edge of it and I think sometimes of the dress, of Celeste's hands on the lace, of the woman in the mirror seeing herself and thinking, yes, this. I think of my sister standing at a vineyard in October in the same dress, looking out at cameras. I think of whether she felt in that moment what I had felt, whether she felt like herself, or whether she felt like the shadow of someone she'd always wanted to be. I think she probably didn't get to feel it the way I had. Some things can't be taken and felt in the same way they were made. Then I put on my jacket and go outside and run. The mornings are mine, the life is mine, the grief is mine, and so is the healing, and so is whatever comes next. I put the garment bag in a donation pile last Saturday. I don't think I need it anymore. That's the whole story, or as much of it as I know how to tell. If you're reading this because you're in the middle of something similar, something unimaginable, something you thought only happened to other people, I want to tell you, it's going to be a long time before it doesn't hurt. It's going to be longer than you think. There is no fast version of surviving family betrayal. The grief has its own timeline and it doesn't negotiate. But I also want to tell you, the version of yourself that comes out the other side of this is going to be someone you didn't know you were capable of being. Not harder, not more defended, just more fully present, more truly your own. The cruelest thing Dara did was not taking the man or the dress. The cruelest thing was that she was certain enough to act, that I would spend the rest of my life diminished by what she took. She was wrong about that. Being wrong about that is, I think, all the consequence she's ever going to need.